All right, well, welcome everybody to the MCSS Spring Webinar Series, Uncomfortable but Necessary Conversations. My name is Dave Johnson. I'm the current Michigan Council for the Social Studies President, and I am also the chair of the Online Learning Committee, and I'll be your host this evening. We will get started in just a few moments, but before we do, a couple of quick announcements. This is the second installment of our spring series of webinars tackling different avenues for teaching uncomfortable topics in the classroom. MCSS is pleased to offer this series for free to anyone who wants to participate, and recaps of this and future sessions will be available on our website and on our official YouTube channel shortly after it ends. 3 of our sessions are already live for registration, including tonight's, and there's at least 1, if not 2 more that will go live for registration shortly. We've been working right up to the wire on this one with presenters, so the rest of them should be up shortly. None of these great offerings would be possible without the support of some fantastic presenters who have given their time and expertise to come to us this spring. We thank them all for the time they've spent preparing and getting ready for us. So like I said, the rest of the installments in this series will be released to the MCSS website shortly. A few quick housekeeping items. We were not able to get sketches for this offering, so I apologize for that in advance. Please make sure your microphones are muted while our presenter is presenting. As quiet as you may try to be, fingers on keyboard, shuffling paper around on your desk, that's often picked up by microphones. I've done it myself. So feel free to unmute if the presenter asks you to. And Eric did say beforehand that if you've got a question, feel free to break in. So break in or throw it in the chat, which I'll be monitoring. With that out of the way, let's meet our presenter. Our presenter this evening is Eric Hemingway. He's the Director of Archives and Records for the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians in Harbor Springs. He is Anishnaabek, Odawa, and Eric works to collect and curate historical materials pertaining to Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians. Those materials are used to create exhibits, signage, publications, curriculum, program, and all go to help support the tribal government. Eric has experience working under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. I knew I was going to botch that word. And Eric currently sits on the Michigan Historical Commission and the Little Traverse Conservancy. He's a past board member for the Michigan Historical Society, the Michigan Humanities Council, the National Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act Review Committee, and Emmett County Historical Commission. Now, in addition to all of this, I have had the distinct honor of working with him on multiple projects around the state. He is an exceptional human being. He is a wonderful collaborator, a powerful speaker, and an amazing teacher. You are all in great hands this evening. So with that, I'm going to shut up and I'm going to turn things over to Eric. Eric, Ani, and welcome.
Ani, how can I follow up with such an introduction? I mean, thank you, Dave, for very flattering. I'm blushing up here in frigid northern Michigan. I think it's 30 degrees right now and up here in Emmett County, but sunny, but it's literally freezing. So that's why I'm all bundled up in my basement with a space heater and a hoodie and everything else. But glad to be here. And when Dave asked me to join the project, I didn't even ask what it was. I said, yeah, sure. I just love doing these types of collaborations and having conversation. So this is what it is. It's a conversation. Not having any visuals, no PowerPoint, no videos. We're just gonna go old school, so to speak, and just have hopefully some feedback amongst ourselves and talk about something that I've seen my entire life, but not many others have seen. And this is Anishinaabe history, and especially in the educational system. Talk about some of my personal experiences with this, both in the public school system. I grew up in Cross Village, Harbor Springs, and then also through my professional experience of being I call myself a helper, educator, storyteller, historian, what have you. I'm doing this for almost 20 years now and working with classrooms and other institutions. So, but first, I'd like to just give a traditional introduction of who I am. It helps center myself and with what I want to say and how I want to deliver it. I'm going to try to use my traditional language of Anishnaabemowin. And here we go. Biju and Disnakas, Anamatikamekw and Donjaba, Anishinaabe Endau, Jijak Dodam, Jinage, Archives and Records for the Waganaksing Odawak, and then Gitchenda Mapi to Mandoki, Enjaniki, and it's Gisina Gijigat. So one of my names is the Lynx. My English name is Eric Hemingway. I self-identify as Anishnaabek Odawa. I am from the place of the Prayer Tree, Cross Village, Michigan, and I am of the Crane clan. And I am the director of Archives and Records for the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians, and I'm happy to be here to share my work tonight on this cold day. So it's a little bit of my language I'm trying to learn piece by piece. So I like to start with that. And talking about Native history is something I grew up with as a Native person. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a household that was steeped in tradition and culture and history, but also steeped in, the reality of being Native in the 20th century. We were very poor. Unfortunately, my father wasn't in my life. It was a single parent, my mom and my grandma raising me. So I never said I was a single parent. I had my mom and I had a grandparent. So in my mind, I had two parents, but the system looks at this as you're from a single family home, a big home, lots of aunts and uncles coming in and out, nephews, and it was a living, breathing thing home. At any given point, there was 10, 12 people in the house and dogs. And so that was not the exception. It was the norm for a lot of, Native families. And in these types of environments, you're always in this constant state of learning of stories. So I would hear stories from not just my family, but people coming to visit the family from Canada or from Minnesota, and vice versa. We'd go into other places and visit people. So I started to, hear this history very, very early on. And it's a story that I would identify with as an Anishinaabe person, but then I'd go into the schools and this story was invisible. It was non-existent. And it was disheartening. It was very troubling. It was very enraging as I got older and started to understand what was going on. When you get to be this preteen, teenage person and, self-identity and exploring yourself and who you are, and you're being reinforced with this in your home, but you go into this institution that's supposed to further this along and educate you, and it's not happening. It's actually the opposite when I was growing up, where there was no talk of natives, there was no talk of what the history of the local tribe was. We would touch upon tribes for maybe a few days out of the year in social studies, and that's it. And it was always a tribe out west that I had no identity with, no connection, no history. It was the Lakotas or the Sioux, maybe the Navajo, and it was literally for 2 days. And they talked about things that were literally 1,000 miles away. And that's it. And the rest of the story is predominantly, a white male narrative of how this country came to be. And as a Native person sitting there in this room, this classroom, you're invisible and you're absolutely not part of the narrative. And we would joke with some of my buddies of, hey, where are we? We're the Odawa. We're in a Michigan classroom in Harbor Springs. It's very strong Odawa presence, and you're not being talked about. You're disenfranchised at that point. So looking back in hindsight, me and my buddies, it's contributed to us withdrawing because the story wasn't there. Why am I going to engage with this school, and why am I going to engage with my classmates if I'm not having my story told? And it's a good story. It's a real story. It's a true story. It's nothing that's fabricated. It's not mythology. It's not legend. It's not, these terms that we label Native history as being something that's not real. So this is something I really try to stress to educators is, stray away from these terms of myth, legend. It's story, it's history, it's people's identities. But so many times that's how our history is labeled, as something that is a fairy tale almost. It's too, it's too fantastic. It's something that fits into kids' stories, which is not the case. So when our very, very few instances where they would mention, the story of the Odawa, it was in this realm of legend, this realm of myth, just like the Greeks and the Romans, these faraway people that don't exist anymore. And that's a lot of times how natives are portrayed in history, as a non-existent people. Everything happens in the past. We're not talked about in the 20th century. We're not talked about in the 21st century for the most part. That's changing. We'll get to that later. But my experience, I graduated from high school in 1994. So it's not too long ago, but it's a little while ago. But the story wasn't about us. It was always about others who came here. So it's something I want to be mindful of when we're having this discussion tonight, that we want to bring the story to the present day, but also the terms that we use when talking about Native people. Oftentimes I get asked, what are you? And I'm like, well, I'm a Odawa, I'm Anishnaabek, and we have so many labels to put on a Native person. You're Native American, you're American Indian, you're Indian, you're Indigenous, you're First Nations, you're Aboriginal, you're Ottawa, you're Odawa, you're Chippewa. No other race has as many labels as Native people in this country. It's not even close. So a lot of times I get asked the question, what do we call, you? I always prefer, the tribe. What tribe are you talking to? And give that dignity to the tribal nations. Take the time to spell out the tribes that are in your area. You do this for European nations. You do this for other parts of the world. Do that here. And you don't have to label all 500 tribes in the United States. But if you're in Michigan, label there's 12 tribes. That's not a big ask. If you're in Minnesota, there's like 8 tribes. You can at least do that. So we try to, look at what's around you locally. And but when you start to do that, you have to acknowledge what the story is. And so with Native history, it's a tough story. It's a story that often gets brushed under the rug. It gets sidestepped or ignored because of its difficulty, because of its brutality. And it's something that I don't think people want to look in the mirror and say, this happened in my homeland of the United States of America, that this happened not too long ago. And it's still happening in a lot of regards, don't get me wrong. So it's a real tough reflection. It's a real tough, self-awareness test to say, this happened here in my country. And what we're talking about is genocide, removal, invasion. If you ask a Native person what happened, it's not settler, it's invader. If you're looking, because everything is okay, this westward expansion, this westward look, that these settlers, explorers come here and they look west. Well, if you flip it around, a Native person is looking east. And what are they seeing when they look? It's people who come here uninvited, and they're bringing with them this idea that this land and resources is their God-given right, that it's their purpose to be here. It's called manifest destiny. And this is something that's been taught over and over in classrooms, that it was just preordained that, Europeans come here to colonize North America. And you flip this around from a Native perspective, it's invasion. Somebody comes uninvited into your homelands and they start to wage war for your land and resources. How do you phrase that? It's just very, you can phrase it very simply. Invasion, war, war of aggression. So just how we have the perspective is really important with Native history, because usually the perspective is not from a Native lens. And I'm not saying to change the lens 100%, but at least offer the Native lens into the story. So you have multiple perspectives of what this is. Now you can set them side by side with these other narratives that are long-standing, and they're not untrue for some populations. I'm not saying that they didn't happen, but if that's the only narrative you're putting out there, and all these other populations are saying, hey, wait a minute, that's not how we see this or how it was for us. And it creates this story that Native people just vanished. We faded away under this crushing wave of settlement. We are gone. And when the people are gone, all the problems are gone. You don't have to deal with the population if they're gone. But we're not. We're 1% of the population, so we're not huge, but we're still here. But then again, 1% is not. There's this is just off census records, about 3.6 million natives off the last census out of 370 million people in the United States. But we're still a very visible population. So we're having a disservice and it's injustice when you're such a small population and you're not being talked about in the schools, because we don't have the manpower to get out there and have these large protests and marches. And so people ask me, Eric, how come the natives don't have a 1,000,000-man march? I'm like, because that'd be about 1/3 of our population. To organize 1,000,000 Indians would be this extraordinary feat. So when Standing Rock happened, which was a protest over water and land rights in South Dakota a couple years ago, 10,000 natives gathered, and we were losing our minds. Like 10,000 natives got together for a fight. And for us, it was a watershed moment, huge moment. And then we look at these other protests, like 100,000 people are like, oh man, we just don't have numbers. And that's just the way it is. So when people, go through this whole system of not seeing natives in history, they ask these questions. So native history is difficult, and it's also unique to each tribe in each region. Not every tribe shared the same experiences. We're not this homogeneous people. They all speak the same language and have the same customs and traits and culture. That's complete false narrative. We're all unique. The Odawa are different from the Arapaho. The Arapaho are different from the Seminole. The Seminole are different from the Iroquois. The Iroquois are different from the Arikara. The Arikara are different from the Mandan. The Mandan are different from the Native Hawaiians. So it's all different nations, all different people. And we speak different languages. We have different customs. And we all, for the most part, we've been lumped together as just Indians. That we ride horses, live in teepees, wear headdresses, and we vanished. And none of that's true. There are tribes that ride horses and live in teepees and wear headdresses, absolutely. But that's not every tribe. So that's a really strong historical stereotype we're trying to push through, to just have that base identity for your tribes. And the story that I experienced growing up was that by the 1870s all the tribes just kind of vanished and they were gone with westward expansion. And so something I work on personally as a teacher up here in Northern Michigan is bringing this story into the 20th century with civil rights, with treaty rights and fights for land and resources. And these are things that are unique to the tribes. It's very visible. It's got a lot of primary sources, and it's something that we can touch and feel as a population. But the early history is difficult when you have, let's just start with Columbus. And for one, Columbus wasn't the first European to land in North America, it was the Vikings. So we got to give credit where credit's due. And Leif Erikson landed like 300-400 years before Columbus did. And then he went back home. So he didn't stay and try to colonize. Something went down up in Canada between him and whoever he landed with, Abenaki or Micmac, and probably got in some fights. And the Vikings are pretty tough characters. So I don't know what happened, but he went back. That's not what happened with Columbus. He came and he stayed. So that's usually where the narrative starts. So I like to push the narrative back further and say, no, it's the Vikings. But when Columbus did land, which he did, completely different story. Now I do a lesson plan with my local teacher for the 5th grade up here, and it's a basic question to the kids: should Columbus have his own holiday? And I come in and give the why he shouldn't, and the teacher thankfully plays devil's advocate and says this is why he should. And so we go back and forth, and then the kids go back and forth, and they can switch sides at any time, but they have to state their argument on why they're doing so. And I give some of the facts to the kids that Columbus did these lack of a better term, atrocities. And I start with saying, okay, I know you're in 5th grade. So what I tell you is for 5th grade. And when you get to 11th grade and I see you again, hopefully, we'll talk about more of the story because it's too gruesome right now. You can't take it. It's not for your 5th grade mind. And naturally, the 5th grade boy is like, well, you want to hear the whole story. Like, no, you really, trust me, you can't hear the whole story. So we talk about what is appropriate. We push the envelope a little bit. That, Columbus enslaved kids. He chopped off their hands when they didn't dig enough gold out of that one day. That people were starving and they were hunting them with dogs. And that within 50 years, that entire tribe was extinct. One generation after meeting Columbus. And when I get to 11th grade, we talk about how Columbus made his money, which was off the sale of preteen girls. He made more money from sex trafficking than he did gold or anything else. So he was into human trafficking. He was into selling young girls because they brought the most money. And these all come from primary sources from Columbus's own men, because they're writing about a people that they didn't obviously care for, but they knew they were going to be gone, and they were right. So when, as a Native person, you hear these stories in your home about this utter monster, like, this is horrible. This is some of the worst things you can hear that's true. And you go to a school and they're praising him as a hero, as a person who has a holiday and a person that deserves recognition. And you're just, for me, I was shell shocked. I think this is unbelievable. And I go back and tell my mom, and she'd get mad and said, no, that's not the whole story. This is the other half of the story. And as a Native kid going through this system, it's, again, disenfranchises you, that the system celebrates somebody who would do such things. So what does that speak into your Native population? That your story doesn't matter. Your story is going to be erased, non-existent, just like these people that Columbus met with. So it starts there, and we would go through these lessons about, the founding fathers and, the beginning of America, and tribes are never mentioned at all, whatsoever, about the interactions, all the wars, all the helping of settlers, all the violence. I mean, nothing is mentioned about the first contact with, the colonists and natives. Now, you read a little bit about Pocahontas, the early settlers, because Pocahontas is a romanticized story, a feel-good story that's been perpetuated over and over, and it just becomes this grandiose myth. That's a true myth at this point, because the real story of Pocahontas is that she was a girl about 12 years old, and she was kidnapped and forced to marry John Rolfe because of the war between her father's tribe and the settlers. That's the story. But when you turn on Disney or any of these new renditions, Pocahontas is this full-grown woman. She falls madly in love with him. She throws herself at him against her father's will and runs off to be married happily ever after. That's not the story. Then Indians kind of disappear for about 100 years until you get to the Plains in the early 1800s with the Plains Indians, with the teepees and the horses, the very strong visuals. Then we disappear again, basically forever. So we pop up a couple times, and then you're gone. So why is that? Well, when you start to fill in the gaps, it's a really, really powerful, sad, unbelievable story of injustice, war, but also perseverance. I never want to end on this victimization note, but that the tribes went through all of this, and some survived, some didn't. And when you talk about Native history, you have to talk about the tribes that never survived. There are tribes that are extinct as a people since contact. And that's the most difficult story to tell, is that entire populations are gone from disease, warfare, displacement. That's a story that most people don't want to look in their own history and look at and say, hey, yeah, what happened here is an atrocity. We would call these war crimes today if we're to be honest about this, where the armies would go through and they would burn villages, and not just burn the villages, but destroy all the food. So people couldn't eat through the winter. And this happened over and over and over. And I read these from military records. I read these from Commissioner of Indian Affairs federal reports, from letters from Indian agents that talk about the army coming through and destroying food. So it's one thing to drive the people off, but when you burn their food, that's a whole nother story. That's ensuring that kids don't eat. That's ensuring that old people don't eat. And they have to go and fend for themselves through the winter, which is the most difficult time of year, where that's what the food is prepared for, is to get you through the winter. So they're systematically destroying these people's ways of life. And this isn't just one tribe, it's all the tribes. From Maine to California, there's no exception. So you got to look at that, and you got to look at removal, that it was a policy to remove Indians off their lands. And this was a law in 1830 called the Indian Removal Act. I never heard about this in school, heard about it at home. Now, granted, my mom was militant, tough as nails, still is to this day. So she would make sure I would know this, that there was a law to kick us out. And I was like, no. There's never a law to kick us out. She says, yes, there was. And lo and behold, there was a law called Indian Removal Act. And over 200,000 natives are forced off their lands, mostly east of the Mississippi to west of the Mississippi, between 1830 and 1850. But removal was occurring much earlier. Removal was occurring in 1492. It just accelerated through each generation. So this law is an ugly piece of American history. You look at it and say it's on the books, it's a federal law. But the reality is, families are being displaced. Kids are being forced at gunpoint to march hundreds of miles under adverse conditions to an alien environment that has almost no success for them. They don't know where to grow food. They don't know where to hunt. They have to depend on the United States for rations. So once you're removed, the battle's not won. It just really started. And over 40 tribes were removed. And Oklahoma and Kansas were the destinations for these tribes. And they're still there. They're still there to this day. Most of them are from Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan. We had removal in Michigan. We're not exempt. There was Potawatomis who were hunted down near Battle Creek in Kalamazoo, hunted down by the Federal Army in 1838. And one of the stories I read is that a group of Potawatomi in Battle Creek area in 1838 got wind that the army was coming. So they decided to make a run for Canada instead of Kansas, because Kansas was pretty much a death march. So they split before the army got there. And this is a village, mind you. This is women, children, elders. It wasn't a war party, about 60 people, and they're making a run for Walpole Island, which is in southern Ontario. And the general who's in charge of clearing Michigan of all the Indians is General Brady. He gets to the village, it's vacated, and he asked one of the local settlers, who's the neighbors to the tribe, said, do you want to help me and make some money by tracking these Indians? And the settler says, yes. So I learned all of this from the memoirs of this settler. And so he talks about tracking these Indians, and they get to a large swamp just south of Battle Creek, in Flint. And mind you, 1838, Michigan's still a pretty wild place. And the general says, hey, nobody in the right. So the general is chasing this tribe, and they get to the swamp. And they go into the swamp and find this village of Potawatomis. And naturally, they don't want to fight. They're not there to fight. They're just there to survive. And they give up peacefully. They don't want to fight. So immediately, the army and its hired hands take the children. and they separate the kids from the families because they know that once you separate kids from their parents, that the fight's done. They're not going to do anything. They will do whatever they can to reconnect with their children. So they separate the kids from the families, and the settler remarks that immediately, the parents, they're wailing, they're throwing themselves on the ground, fleeing for their kids, and the army proceeds to lay them face down in the dirt and the mud and shackle them, and the settler says they start talking in Indian and crying, and he makes this really strong remark that I don't know what they're saying, but I know what it means. And what he's talking about is that they want their kids. That's plain and simple. And this happened in our state in 1838, not a long time ago, that people were actually being paid to track down natives, capture them, and send them out west. It was a business. So much like we think about slavery, where people are being sold and bought, the same thing was happening with Native people across this whole country, just in a different capacity, that they would be paid to be captured and sent out west, or worse, that there was bounties on Indians throughout this country until the late 20th century. And California has a horrendous history of having bounties. There's a book that just came out about 4 or 5 years ago called An American Genocide. And it's all about the bounty system in California in the 19th century. And I got about a quarter of the way through it, and it was too much. I read this stuff enough as it is, but this was just one atrocity after the other about how California was paying its settlers to go through and hunt Indians and not transport them, to kill them. And this was done to take the land because of the gold and the agriculture and all the rich resources that were out there. So that's a part of the story that doesn't often get told. And that's a really tough story. And that was happening in Minnesota in 1862 with the Lakota Uprising. It was over land again. The Lakota people were in a tough spot. They didn't have a lot of land. They didn't have a lot of resources. People were starving. They needed food. And the settlers kept pouring onto Lakota lands that they had reserved from their treaties. So as a last resort, you fight. And this is what gets lost in the story. And that it's like this common narrative that these Indians were hyper aggressive and we were called hostiles. That's a term that was used by the army, by society, the hostiles. Well, you look at it through a different lens, you are going to the last resort. You have no other means. You're being pushed over and over and over. You're being relocated. You're having your land taken. You're having your game taken. And at the end of the day, for some of these communities, it came down to, how can I feed my family? How can I do this? I have starving kids. I got to fight back. And that's what happened. So there's a Lakota uprising, Lakota War in 1862. And the state of Minnesota put bounties out on the Lakotas in southern Minnesota. And they had advertisements in newspapers about hunting Indians down and bringing them in for $200 per redskin. So this is where this term is often used, and it causes so much controversy. It's a racist term on face value, but there's also a more sinister connection to the term red skin. And it's used in terms of bounties and genocide. So this is going on in 1860s, right over a state away. And to have newspapers have these advertisements is akin to the advertisements that were being used, flyers for runaway slaves. If you catch this person, we'll pay you. But for the natives, they didn't want them back alive. That's a story that doesn't get told very often, but it's part of the story. So people ask, Eric, how come you're 1% of the population? Well, give me 10 minutes. We'll talk about why we're 1%. It wasn't just by accident. It wasn't haphazard. Yes, diseases did decimate tribes. And I was just talking with a colleague yesterday about this, how, we're going through this sickness right now, this pandemic, and how people are acting, and it's just affecting everything on every level. And I just 150 years ago, my ancestors were going through this same exact thing, but on another level with smallpox, influenza, measles, where we had no immunity to this and it was just killing us by the thousands. Now we talk about that a little bit, but let's get into the details of this. And that it wasn't just by accident, I don't believe. Like, people knew that they were sick and they were settlers, and they would not distance themselves from tribes. They'd set up their towns and they go onto their lands and make contact with them, knowing that they're going to get sick, but they kept doing this anyway. And a perfect example of this is Holland, Michigan. Holland, Michigan started out as an Odawa settlement from Odawa here in Emmett County. And the US government was saying, you need to stop roaming around like a savage. You need to stay in one area, plant your crops, get livestock, be civilized, quote unquote. So the Chief Wakazu, he said, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to go back to my hunting grounds, my winter grounds down by Black Lake. And that's what he did. He took his community and went to Black Lake. Then all these Dutch settlers started to come in, and they were bringing diseases. Now, did the Dutch settlers say, hey, we got things that make these people very sick. Let's distance ourselves. Let's quarantine. Let's social distance. No, they weren't. They were setting up shop, building towns, making contact. And the diseases were just decimating this Odawa village. It got so bad that they had to leave and really social distance and go up to the Leelanau. And they established what we call the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians. But they literally had to remove themselves in order to survive. Nobody knows that. Not many people know that story. Why isn't that told in, Michigan history? It's a vital part of the story. And we talk about all of the wars that the tribes fought in. The tribes were instrumental in the creation of the United States, without a doubt. From the treaties that ceded all the lands, but also to the buildup of the Revolutionary War. We talk about the French and Indian War a little bit, but this is a world war fought on multiple continents with major repercussions occurring right here in the Great Lakes. And hundreds of Odawa and Ojibways are fighting in this war against the British. And one of the major grievances for the colonists that will come out of this would be the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where the British said, this is a boundary line you can't cross. Because if you cross the Appalachians, that's Indian land, it's Indian territory. We just got done fighting 2 wars with these guys. Leave them alone. But the colonists saw that as an infringement on their rights, that they can't have that land across the Appalachians. But when we talk about revolutionary, it's about, tea and taxes, which it's part of the story, but there's a bigger story going on. It's Indian land, that they needed this land in order for them to prosper. But we don't talk about that. We don't talk about what Pontiac and the French and Indian War build up to this. Not much, not like it should be. And the influence that men like Tecumseh had in the War of 1812. And then we have the Western tribes and their leaders. We touch upon real quick, but we don't touch upon what's going on with them, with Indian removal and reservations and loss of land. That's how America really becomes America in some regard. You have to get the land somehow. And it's through treaties and it's through war. It's through removal. It's not an accident that all these tribes are in Oklahoma. It's by design. And that's a design, like I said, we don't like to look at in the mirror as the United States. That's my opinion. I mean, it's easy to look at other countries and what they did and what's wrong, but we did some pretty horrific things to Native people here. And the problem, or what I'm having trouble with now, is like, how do you tell this story? It's like you just can't bombard people. I found it's almost too much. It's like all at once you get all this. It's like, how do you make steps to tell the story that it's inclusive throughout the entire story, throughout the entire timeline? But be honest in the story. be honest what Columbus did, be honest with, what the United States was when it was created. The Indians were not part of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. They're written in as merciless Indian savages in the Declaration of Independence. I mean, these are foundational documents that are the pillars of this country, and that's how natives are labeled in these foundational documents: a merciless Indian savage. So how does that set the tone for subsequent generations when they deal with native people? Not very well, not very good. So if we get into, more particular Michigan, I mean, all of this influences Michigan, but with the Michigan story, we fought against the United States. We fought in all these wars. And then after the War of 1812, the tribes go through this massive forced assimilation that's across the country. And we get into what we call treaties. We get into removal. We get into loss of rights. Our religion is banned. Our language is taken away. We get into what we call Indian boarding schools. And these are institutions of forced assimilation where native kids are forbidden to speak their language, practice traditions, severed from their families, sometimes for years, and receive harsh punishment for breaking the rules or even for not breaking the rules. So these institutions were created to make natives non-native, to take the Indian out of the Indian. And we had 3 of these schools in Michigan, one up by Baraga, one in Mount Pleasant, and one in my backyard in Harbor Springs. And the Harbor Springs school operated until 1983. It was one of the last boarding schools closed in the country. So I know quite a few people who actually went to the school in the 50s and 60s. And that story is very much alive in our community. So that's part of our history that often doesn't get told, about these different types of institutions, so to speak. And also, I was having a conversation with another educator, and just simple civil rights. It's natives had their own civil rights struggles in the 1950s and 60s. And a lot of it revolves around land and access to resources and cultural resources that is very unique to the tribes, because we were here first, and a lot of our spirituality and religion revolve around rivers and trees and part of the landscapes. And we're having to fight to have access to these or keep them intact, so to speak. No other race has an Indian Religious Freedom Act, but Indians do. And that's 1978, that it was illegal technically for tribes to practice their religion openly. No other race has a Religious Freedom Act. We have the Indian Child Welfare Act. We had to have this law that is in place to rectify all the large number of native children being taken out of homes and put into non-native homes or in boarding schools. It's essentially breaking up families. So we have to have a law that says if a native child goes into foster care, the child should be with the tribe first or their family, which wasn't happening for decades. So families are still being broken up. So I mean by a lot of these things that are more recent that we have to deal with in the 20th century. It's not all 1700s and 1800s. And even up to the present day, we have this large epidemic of missing and murdered Native women. Native women have the highest rate of being murdered or missing in North America. That's going on right now in Canada and United States. So these are issues that we want to bring to the forefront and awareness for. So it's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot going on. So I always, we have to start with the history. I'm a historian. I like to say this all just didn't pop up overnight. Let's look at the pieces that brought this about. And these pieces are ugly to look at. Who wants to look at removal, bounties, forced assimilation? It's a primary source from a letter from one of the chiefs here at Emmett County, Wagonuxing. And this is in 1831. And it's a his pushback against the local Catholic priest, saying, I'm not going to convert. I've been doing this my whole life, and my ancestors were not doing it. I'm not doing it. Anybody talks about the local priest, ordering all the Odawas to come and burn all their sacred items in front of the church in downtown Harbor Springs, to show that you're, committed to the faith. So, what if somebody asked, a Catholic, you're going to burn your rosary, you're going to burn your Bible, you're going to burn all of these things as part of your rituals in order to show your faith. But that exact same thing happened here. But this happened all over the country too, not just in Michigan. So these are pieces of the story that we try to get out there. And when I tell the story, I back it up with all my primary sources, all the sources that I have, whether it's a letter or a story that was recorded. To me, somebody tell me a story is a primary source to me. I don't need them to verify it. If a survivor from the boarding school comes forward and says, this is what happened, I'm like, I'm not going to argue that. Can I tell your story? Ask permission. So Native history is complicated because it's so many different tribal nations. It's messy. It's dark in a lot of ways. But also, it's a story, like I said, of perseverance, where people are put to the test. They're being constantly tested, but they constantly bounce back. And in doing so, I always look back at how am I here? It's because of all this, extraordinary leadership and events and people that went on in history. And as we go through Native history, that's going to pop up as well. For every dark time, there's somebody who comes in and counters it to make sure that the people are here. So it's not always doom and gloom. It is a lot of doom and gloom, but there's also a lot of bright spots. And these are inspirational stories for anybody, Native or non-Native, to look at what people did in their own state. And a lot of times it's through education that people, use their brains and their smarts and their wits to avoid removal and to out west. I always go back to this because it's such a reality for the tribes here in Michigan, that the government wanted us out in the 1830s. They were hunting Potawatomi down. It was coming. And how do you do this? How do you avoid this fate? You use your brain. You get all your leaders here, they're your communities, and you devise a game plan and you execute it, and it works. There's some bumps in the road, of course, but it works. Like, for example, the leaders here at Little Travers, they've seen the writing on the wall that they're probably going to kick us out. How do you avoid that? Well, in one November morning in 1835, a delegation of our leaders got into birch bark canoes in November and left Harbor Springs and paddled all the way to Washington, D.C. to negotiate a treaty with Andrew Jackson, Lewis Cass, and Henry Schoolcraft. These are three men who are intimately anti-Indian, pro-removal. But your back's against the wall. What do? You got to be preemptive, and that's what they did. So that, to me, that's an extraordinary story. It's just mind-boggling to do this in that time of year, to meet these men. But they did it, and they were successful because we're still here. So it's not always the, oh my God, this is horrible. I can't read this anymore. There's a lot of that. But then on the flip side, it's like, wow, that's an amazing story. I never knew that. How this is in my backyard of Kalamazoo or Harbor Springs and, Keweenaw Bay. All these tribes have their own stories like that to counter these other stories. But I believe, though, as a nation, we've been programmed to think that Indians are non-existent through media, through movies, through cartoons. Like, I've seen some really horrible Bugs Bunny cartoons from the 40s and 50s, where Bugs is like shooting Indians and he's making a tally and he's singing like 1 Indian dead, 2 Indian dead. It's like, and these are what kids are watching. And, they're being programmed, that these Indians are savage, hostiles, eradicated. And then you go into the movies, and all the movies are these vanishing Indians, Dances with Wolves. You know, I remember watching that movie, and because it was the rave when I was growing up, everybody loved it. You know, it's like, this is a beautiful story. I'm like, I remember watching with my grandma and my mom in the movie theater, and they got so mad they drug me out of the movie theater. It wasn't even finished. And like, I was like 12 or something, and I was like, okay, it's going to be an awkward ride home, and a lot of profanity on the ride home. You know, so I watched it later on, and I got a little bit older, and I got it. You know, it's like this vanity project for Kevin Costner where he plays Indian and he tries to save the Indians, and the Indians can't help themselves, and it's inevitable that they'll just fade away because of the, you know, this wash of settlers. It's horrible, horrible movie, but it looks good. You know, they got real Indians, and they look authentic, and you know, the characters are good, and it's true. It looks good, but it's a vanity story. And then you get to Last of the Mohicans. Just the story itself. There's no more Mohicans. That's not true. They're in Wisconsin. They're the Stockbridge Munsee. So it's like this, I went out there and I visited them. And I was like, where are you from? They're like, New York. I'm like, how'd you get here? Oh, we got kicked out, you know, over 100 years. We ended up in this swamp in Wisconsin because we kept being pushed off our land. And I go, well, who's part of your tribe? And they said, Mohican. I kind of, you know, did that. And they're like, oh, that damn movie, that damn book, Last of the Mohicans. We're still here. I'm like, okay, I didn't say nothing. I'm like, yeah, I know it. I get it. So everybody thinks they're gone. Not true. They're still here. They're just not in New York. So it's an uphill battle for us a lot of times to even prove that we're here. I mean, I was at the gym last year. That's like my safe place. You know, I don't want to talk to people. I want to do my thing, and I put my headphones in and listen to my devil music and get it out, you know, and take care of business. And right before I put my headphones in, this lady come up to me, and she was giving me the up and down, looking, like, examining me. I hate that. And I'm just like, oh, here we go. And I had some shorts on. I got a lot of tattoos, all about tribal, like true Odawa designs. And she's looking at my tattoos, and she's like, what are those? I'm like, well, they're different designs that are important to me. And she goes, well, were you in the military? I'm like, no, I was never in the military. And she goes, are you sure? I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I was never in the army or anything. I would have remembered that part of my life. And she goes, well, what are they? I go, they're part of my tribe, Odawa, Anishnaabek. And without any hesitation, she goes, you don't look Indian to me. I'm like, whoa, shots fired. Like, what's your name again? I don't even know your name. And she goes, no, you don't look Indian. You don't have long hair. I'm like, I don't have any hair, lady. And she goes, you're not very, you know, you don't have dark skin. She was going through all the stereotypes right in front of me. And I just was taken back. And I'm like, this is happening. And she felt so comfortable questioning my identity. And I finally said, stop. You're being rude. You're being racist. You're being inappropriate. And she got offended. And I said, well, see that guy over there, that African-American guy, that black guy? She goes, yeah. I go, would you go up to him and say, you don't look black enough? And she goes, no, that'd be really rude. I was like, nothing I can do. So I put my headphones in and went away. So this stuff still goes on to this very day, of these obstacles we got to get over, of who we are. So again, part of getting to who we are is a story of what happened in the past. That's why it's so important that people don't realize there was forced assimilation policies, civilization policies. People ask me, Eric, you have this really great introduction in your language. Do you speak anymore? I'm like, not really. Well, why don't you? Because it was systematically taken out of my community for over 200 years. That's why. There's no other explanation. My ancestors were forced to assimilate to survive. Nobody wants to hear that. It's because I've seen, now the pendulum is swung the other way where it's cool to be Indian. I've had so many people come up and like, I think I'm Indian. I did the DNA test. I'm like, yeah, cool, but you just can't buy in, all of a sudden. You can't go to 23andMe and say, oh, hey, I'm part of the tribe. It doesn't work that way. So, but before growing up, it wasn't cool to be Indian, and especially my mom's generation. Definitely not cool. A lot of discrimination here in Michigan. I remember being taken to protest with my mom in the 80s in Charlevoix over Indian fishing rights. And the Indians, the Odawa and Ojibwe, were claiming they had rights to fish in the Great Lakes with gill nets. And some people can remember this. It got really heated. I mean, there was violence. People were beating up each other. Tires were getting slashed. Shots were fired. And they would have these protests at Charlevoix in northern Michigan where you'd see these signs that say, save a fish, Spirit Indian. And this is right in our own backyard. Yelling at tribal people, just real ugly. And this is the 1980s. So if we're telling the story, we also got to bring it, like I said, to the present day. Can't be stuck in the 1800s. We're not riding around with Kevin Costner, and he's not saving us. We got to bring it right now and see what's going on. And, and as always, as the story, it explains things. So people ask me, how come you got fish? Well, this is because, of these rights we retained through legal agreements called a treaty. It's not a privilege, it's a right retained. That's why we can do these things today. So that brings me up to my hour, Dave. I just want to stop my ranting and raving for a minute and see if we have any questions and get a conversation going.
There are a couple of questions in the chat, and I know a few others have some questions as well. So we'll start with Michelle's question about resources, websites, source recommendations for educators to go to. What do you have for us, aside from amazing stories, which we appreciate you sharing?
That's one of the big pushes now is creating a resource kit. I call it a toolbox. I mean, this is something I know we talk about, Dave, with the Michigan Open Book, as compiling all of this. So something I would do immediately is look to the tribes. Each tribe is a government, and they all have education departments. So that's where I would start first. Or they have an archives or a historical program or a museum. So see what the tribes have. They all have websites. And I'd also look at what, the Michigan Historical Center is doing a little bit more in terms of its educational resources. I've worked with Dave on a few things, Michigan Open Book. But the tribes is where I would start first.
Aaron, go ahead and unmute and give us your question or your comment.
Oh, yeah, thanks. It's just a comment. So, Eric, I saw you speak pre-COVID at a regional workshop that was sponsored by the George Washington Teacher Institute at Mount Vernon, and it was at Anishnaabek's public schools. And so I remember sitting there being blown away by the stories that you were telling while we were there. And so when I saw this opportunity come across and it was your name, I was like, oh my God, I remember him. And so I signed up right away with this expectation that it was going to be really good again, and it was great. So I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to share this depth of knowledge and experience that you have with us. It's great, really.
No, I really appreciate that, Aaron, and that was a tricky one, with the Mount Vernon George Washington Society thing. Tough, because George is not a hero in our eyes. He's known as the village town destroyer because he would burn all these Iroquois villages in their food. But man, you can't get any bigger than George, first president, founding father. And I'm like, no, he's got a dark side. Land speculator. He made all his wealth from land. He put his surveying skills to good use to acquire a lot of land from tribes. So from our perspective, George is not a hero. So yeah, I appreciate you coming and chiming in, but that was a tough one, but it went well, I think.
Yeah, it went really well. And I think you're right. You know, all of our founding fathers and all these, you know, heroes that we have, they all people them to start looking at the other side of what really happened. I think the better off we're all going to be. So yeah, you did a great job on that one. It was really good.
Thank you.
Florian, I know when we were having tech issues, you had you mentioned you had some questions. So why don't you unmute and ask away?
Always do. So from an international perspective, having grown up in Germany and lived in Australia and New Zealand, no other nations and societies or governments have apologized for the genocide that has been done historically, and reparation have been paid, if you even can pay for that. But you know, there are museums, there are acknowledgements. The histories, they try to accurately reflect history in the school books and teach it appropriately. So I guess my question is, do you ever think something, an apology would happen from the US government to Native nations? And then I did hear you say you didn't want to have that victim sense, right? And then you also said we do prefer to be acknowledged for the individual kind of tribes, that it's not a big group, but that each tribe has its own identity. And I was just wondering in the back of my head if that is counterproductive to the US government at the federal level to come forward with an apology. You know, when I feel like you're splitting up in a smaller group, or you say we have not been the victims. So that's just what I have been thinking when I was listening to you, but maybe you can elaborate and clarify and tell me a way I can better understand that.
Well, to get to your first part of your question, I don't know if the U.S. will ever apologize. It hasn't happened to date. You know, I would like to think that something would come forward to acknowledge at least a portion of what happened. I mean, because a lot of these apologies that I've seen have been in regard to the residential or boarding schools. And Canada went through a whole reconciliation and acknowledgement, and they're actually, I think, paying some of the families for what happened. So that was very specific to that one piece of history. Now, I'm not sure what happened in New Zealand, or I know Australia, their relations with their Indigenous communities, with the Aborigines, is really strained. But back to America, I don't know. And where would you start? You know, would you start with the boarding schools overall, or the wars? And if you get into that, then you have to acknowledge what happened. You're specifically saying this happened to you with us. And it gets into this first step of, you know, awareness, acknowledgement. So is the country ready for that? I don't know. But I see more organizations and more states starting to do this. And I think that's where the push is going to be. Of course, you know, local grassroots. You know, you see universities or states, you know, they're doing land acknowledgements. They're taking Columbus Day and turning it into an Indigenous Peoples Day. You know, it's going to start there and work its way up. And in terms of, I'm just going to, you know, I would prefer that the, you know, this, if something was to happen on a federal level, they acknowledge every single tribe, because we are treated as sovereigns, as tribal nations, instead of saying to all the Native Americans. That doesn't cut it in my eyes. You got to address every tribal nation individually and send this type of message out. It can be the same message, but it needs to be addressed to every single tribal nation. But that's just that's just me. I mean, you can talk to another Native person, like, yeah, send it to everybody. That's fine. So everything tonight is just for me. So take that with a grain of salt.
Thank you.
Kyle, you're up next if you want to unmute and ask.
Hi, Ani, Eric. In working a little bit with different organizations, I was wondering if you had any interaction with the United Tribes of Michigan and any of their pushes. And in that guise, you mentioned earlier about going in and pushing into a fifth grade classroom and working with those students. This kind of can go to Dave as well, but both of you, would you have any suggestions to the Michigan Council for Social Studies to make recommendations to MDE to modify or make suggestions to modify the standards to push a lot of the standards that are in third and fifth grade for Native American studies into higher grades like high school US history?
Where do we start with this, Dave? I mean, we went through and did some of the work on the standards, and that was a labor of love, so to speak. And so there is awareness to changing the standards for the MDE. And what I do I'm just lucky enough where I have a local teacher who I know well, and it's the school I went to. So I literally live 3 miles from the school, and we work together side by side to develop these lessons. So it's a very, very personal relationship, something that I don't have with other schools. I mean, Harbor Springs is where I graduated, and I'm, able to go in and meet with the teacher on a moment's notice and keep that relationship going through the years where we do these lessons. So to have something on a broader scale, I think you would have to, again, there's a coalition of tribal education directors and the tribes. You have United Tribes, and they would be the more, I guess, appropriate conduit to approach MDE. I just do history, and that's it. I stay in my wheelhouse. And of course, this goes into social studies and civics, but I also have this approach of working with the teachers first, one-on-one, where we get to the lesson plans and I co-teach them with the teachers. And I like doing that personally because, one, the teachers invested, and it's their classroom, it's their space. And they're a teacher and I'm not, so we bounce how things can work. And then once it's developed, we run it. But for a broader scale, you'd have to go from the tribal governments.
I will just add on the standards front. Rebecca Bush and I co-chaired the US history team. And Eric was the first person we called for the team to get more of the Indigenous perspective, at least in the fifth, eighth, and the high school. And I think MDE has been very open to the conversations, at least when I've been a part of some of the conversations, they've been open to it. I think probably the dumbest thing we did in updating the standards, and if I am on the team, standards have about a 10-year shelf life. So, I'm already starting to gear up and go, well, my vacation from standards writing is half over, how long it took. But, if I'm around on the next pass through, the stupidest thing we did was we all went off into our silos. We all went off into, at first when it started, we had like a civics team that did civic stuff, an econ team that did econ stuff, a history team that did history. That is the single dumbest thing in hindsight we did, because none of those teams talked to one another. And then, we released a version of the standards that were apparently too liberal. And then, 3 months later, a new version written by a senator came out that were too conservative. And we had to kind of reconcile all of that. Through none of that did we have the kind of conversations that should have happened. We all stayed in our silos. So I think we made some progress, but it's by no means done. And if I have anything to say about it next time they're updated, we're not going to do that silo piece for that exact reason that you mentioned, Kyle, to get more of those pieces from other parts of the standards into places where they should still be. Now you do have the freedom to weave any of that in with our change in language from IE to examples may include but are not limited to, but more should be done to make that explicit. I 100% agree with you. Eric, a couple of questions from the chat. Any thoughts on the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian? Michelle said she saw some upcoming student webinars that looked interesting.
Yeah, NMAI is something, a resource I always push. You know, it's they put out a lot of great curriculums. They have a lot of resources at their fingertips. So yeah, that's one of the first recommendations I make is go to the NMAI website, and they have a whole just list of resources. So yeah, it's good, but it's by no means perfect. You know, like for example, when I went there and they seen their permanent exhibit, the Odawas weren't listed, and I'm like, wait, okay, we got work to do. So, but it's a great start. And the National Congress of the American Indian, NCAI, is another really good resource. This is across the country, so they have a lot of different viewpoints from different resources. And then the Department of Interior, the BIA website, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they have links to all these different tribal coalitions and groups, and it's just it's a lot of rabbit holes you got to go down, but it's worth checking out.
I always have a ton of questions for Eric, so I have some. But I would prefer I would prefer questions from our audience first. So, does anyone else have a question you'd like to ask Eric?
I have one still,
go
if
for
I
it.
may. So I understand that you said that your wheelhouse is history, so I totally respect that. I'm still wondering, you know, looking at the inquiry arc of the C3 framework on dimension 3 and 4 on, you know, analyzing information, making informed decision, taking action at the community level. So there's a lot of skills here. Would you say, in addition to learning the history and that knowledge, would it also make sense in your eyes to look at certain skills like storytelling, understanding of sustainable living, understanding of self-governance at the local community level, things like that? So I'm looking more at the skills, because I think, you know, social studies needs to have a lot of skills. It can't be just knowledge. Is there something where you'd say there would be opportunities for students to learn from the history or from Native Americans from the 12 tribes in Michigan to get a better understanding of the current situation in the past?
Yeah, that's one of the, I mean, it's part of the teaching of this is, you know, understanding how history is relayed, you know, and the power of story. And something that we really push is not to discredit oral histories, and that, you know, not everything has been written down, not everything has been recorded. So that's one of the first things we actually I try to stress is how history is passed. And even within written renditions, things change. And it happens all the time where somebody will rewrite a letter, or they'll transcribe a letter and things get lost in translation, or, you know, you take a video and you edit it. I mean, that happens all the time. So something's lost. Same with story. It depends on who's telling it. Things will change. But, you know, the power of the oral story and how that's, you know, the tribal bank essentially. And then how you get this word sustainable, and how this is a really dynamic and fluid, in my mind, idea, and that the tribes had to reinvent a sustainable way of life over and over. And that's part of the history, that they had to adjust constantly on the fly to all of these variables that are being pushed on them, whether it's loss of land, And like the logging industry, it just decimated Michigan to no end. And that's your food, that's your medicine, that's your culture. You know, how do you adjust to this? And they do this all through government and decision making on a very community level. So bands, groups of tribal people would get together and decide, how are we going to navigate this challenge that just happened? We just had, 1,000 acres were cleared. What are we going to do? Oh, okay, now we got to fish more. They make these decisions on the local level, and that's something we always stress is local agency, local government. And this isn't a new idea where, this Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, had this great idea and this was the birth of this. No, this has been happening in this country for thousands of years. True democracy, everybody had a voice, everybody made decisions. And sometimes when these leaders came back from councils, they would talk for days in front of their communities to let them know, be transparent, that this is what happened at this council. This is what is proposed and what's the decision? What are we going to do together? And there was never one chief who made decisions on behalf of everybody. There was multiple chiefs in the entire community. So yeah, we relay this to our students because we want to get away from this idea that Indians are savages, uncivilized. And that's a stereotype that's even to this very day that is just almost impossible to shake at times. That, and that gets into this identity. We battle a lot with names because we get into this period, what we call contact, 1600s for us. But if a lot of archaeologists and old school historians, anything pre-contact is called prehistoric. Like we did not have history until Europeans arrived. That's colonization 101. That's the first step. You did not have a history before our arrival because it wasn't written. So that discredits all of what we're trying to, establish about government and agency and community because you're a savage. Savages don't do that. They don't have a democracy. They don't have votes. And we get into the, how important labels are. They're so important. So with this pre-contact history, you look at archaeological timelines, if somebody from 1400 or 1300 or 1000 AD, they're not called Odawa or Potawatomi. They're called Woodland Indian. You go further back, it's called Archaic Indian. Not Anishinaabe, not Odawa. So your identity has been completely stripped. And you're not Odawa or Potawatomi until the historic period because it's in records. And on the flip side of this, you talk to, a Native person, the oral history said, no, 2,000 years ago, we were Anishinaabe. We were here. So we have this rub with this established identity from the greater culture. And it's really, really hard to get over because if you push the timeline back further and say you weren't here, then this country was just vacated essentially. You land on this open territory that's not really claimed. It's part of the mindset of manifest destiny that you weren't here much longer before us. You don't have a deep stake in it. Now, if you acknowledge that somebody's been in an area for 3,000 years, that's a whole different story. They say, oh, yeah, you've got really deep roots. But on the flip side, the tribes say, yeah, we've been here since time immemorial, since day one. And that's why they fought so hard to stay in the area. So, yeah, we try to line up these different primary sources and to show that we had these things in place, still do. They just went through all these changes throughout time. Some of them forced, some of them weren't. Some of them were, a mix of being forced and, buy-in from the communities. But at the end of the day, somebody came in, they invaded and said, this is ours. And we fought against the Americans 3 times. The Revolutionary War, Little Turtles War, and the War of 1812. And before that, we fought in Pontiac's War. We fought in the French and Indian War. So from about 1750 to 1815, we were in constant warfare to keep what's ours. So I hear these sayings like freedom isn't free and all this. I'm like, yeah, tell me about it. And we've been fighting for freedom for a couple hundred years.
So would you then say that it would be a worthwhile skill for high school students or earlier, to pick up the skill of community-based storytelling on current events or something like that?
Yeah, and this is something I stress, with high school students, and when I'm talking about the boarding school, and they're like, "Where'd you get these stories?" Like somebody told them to me, and that's part of the historical fabric is that story. Will I write it down? Only with permission from the person. They gave me permission to tell it. So now the story becomes a living thing. There's ownership, there's permission, there's rules to this story. And I flip it and say, okay, you have these same things within your family. And an easy, like low-hanging fruit is how many, of you have veterans in your family? Like a bunch of hands go up. And like, well, if your granddad or your dad tells you a story about their time in the service, do you need that written down? They're like, oh, absolutely not. That's the truth. He was there. He fought in this battle. He went to this place. I think it's the same thing. It's your story. It's part of your family history, which is part of the history of that county, history of the state. It feeds into a bigger picture. And then the light goes off and like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. You just got to make it relatable to their immediate family, and then boom, we got history. So we try to do that on a certain level, Florian, kind of shake it up a little bit. But you got to get to the first step of seeing that Anishinaabe people, Native people, were civilized, they were sophisticated, they had government, they had all the things that we have today, just in a different form.
Thank
So
you.
Eric, I have a closing question for you. I've told this story, PC, pre-COVID. I was one of many people that were pick a day on my calendar, I was somewhere rolling out the social studies standards, the new social studies standards. And one of the things in the PowerPoint that we all shared when we were doing rollouts was some of the specific wording that changed in the standards. Particularly the standards and benchmarks, Michigan's first standard set, referred to you as Native Americans. The 2007 version switched the language up to American Indians. And in the 2019 version, we're using Indigenous peoples. Now, I can't remember because I did it 300 bajillion times. I can't remember where it was, but I distinctly remember one place where as I was kind of wandering around during some of the digesting work of let's dig into the standards, I heard this woman. I won't say her name's Karen, but you'll probably think that as I describe it. And I heard her, and I have to think it was for my benefit that she said it loud enough, where she said, well, I don't care what they're calling them in the standards. They are Native Americans. They have always been Native Americans, and I will always refer to them as Native Americans. So I heard this, and I decided, well, I could be a jerk or I could be a subtle jerk. And when in doubt, I always go for subtle. So I had that video of you and I talking back and forth about the specific reason for that. And I just asked everyone after that digesting time, I said, hey, if I let you guys out of here half an hour early, can we do a working lunch and I show you something? And everyone was like, oh, yeah, sure. I was going to let them out early anyway. But over lunch, I showed that video. And it was really fun for me to watch Karen sort of slink further and further down in her chair as you continue to talk about the specific reasons for that wording change. So can you tell us, as a closing comment tonight, why did we change that terminology in the 2019 standards, and might it change again in the 2028 version?
It probably will change, Dave. I mean, just to warn you. So This is a good one to close on because we touched upon this earlier, how natives have all these names. And Native American is, in my mind, I guess it's just me personally, problematic because it's saying that you were American before the United States was created, before Columbus landing, that you're always American. And that's not the case. That takes away from your tribal nation. It takes away from your sovereignty, in a sense, in my mind, to say Native American. And most tribal people, when you ask them how to identify, they're going to say I'm Odawa or Hopi or Pueblo or Arikara. They go with their tribal name. And that Native American is this arbitrary name that's put upon us, but we always have to label things. And I, heard a, African American woman, she just said, how come colored people are always hyphenated? African American, Native American, when you think just American, the first thing that usually comes to mind is white. But if you're of color, you have to have a hyphen. So it just separates out. It's, it segregates in a sense. That if you're truly all American, then you just say you're American, but that's not the case. You have to label by race. And American Indian was the preferred term for, it's a legal term. So Indian we can't get away from because it is a legal term. It's written into the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, treaties, federal law, tribal constitutions. It's a legal term. It's just there. Now, we can move beyond that, but also know in the back of your mind, if you hear Native people saying that Indian, like, why are they saying this? It's a legal term, but it's also been embedded for 500 years. It's really hard to get away from. So I use it all the time. And one of my students caught me like, Eric, you're using that word, and why? I'm like, I'm programmed. I'm trying to deprogram. It's hard. I grew up with this word, and other Indians calling each other Indians for all my whole life. And then I turn on the TV and it's like, oh, the Cleveland Indians and baseball. And then it's like, okay. And then there's high school teams named Indian and a motorcycle named Indian. It's like, it's branding. It's everywhere. So it's hard to get away from. So Native American is a term that I personally would not use because I'm Odawa, I'm Anishnaabek first, and then something else. Now, it's not saying I'm pro or unpatriotic or un-American. I'm just saying I'm pro Odawa, I'm pro Anishinaabe, because that's what my people were 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. That's just how it was. So that's a little bit about Native American, American Indian, Indigenous, First Nations, but rarely do you see the time taken to say Odawa, Navajo, Iroquois, Haudenosaunee. It's not even Iroquois, it's Haudenosaunee. That's where I'd like to see the next step go into. And I always encourage people, just get to know, because now I get the question like, well, I don't know what to do. What do I call you? I'm like, well, call me Eric first. I don't have to have this label all the time. But if you know Native people, get to know who they are and then approach it that way. What do they feel comfortable, identifying with? Don't label them right off the bat. Like that lady labeling me at the gym. She didn't take the time to get to know me. It could have took 2 minutes, but she had all these preconceived notions already built up. So here we are, adversaries, at the gym. It's like, this is stupid. He goes, oh yeah, I thought you were something else. I'm like, why do I have to be anything? Can I be a human?
You're Eric.
I'm Eric. Yeah, I'm a helper. I help out. That's it. That's what I do.
I honestly could listen to you for days. And I'm half tempted to leave the Zoom on here to just continue, because this has been fantastic. This has exceeded my hopes for this particular session, but in the series as well. This is just, this has been really great. So I would like to thank you, Eric, and we can stay on after I do the, MCSS makes me. I say MCSS makes me, I'm the president, I could ignore it, but we like to have the same closing, so we can stay on for a little bit. But we would like to once again thank Eric for his time this evening. This is a really important conversation. We are so lucky to have a generous friend who's willing to bring us more on this important topic. We really value our partnership and are always happy to collaborate with you. As I mentioned at the start of this session, we will have a video recap posted, hopefully in the next 24 to 48 hours. And we invite you to check out future sessions in the series by visiting our website as well. But on behalf of the Michigan Council for the Social Studies and all the people listed on this slide, I really want to thank you for your time and attendance this evening. And I really want to thank Eric for sharing his story. So thank you all, and we'll be back. But stay on if you want to ask more questions, because I totally will.